Thank you, Barry. Good afternoon, everyone. In the interest of time, I'm going to get started right away. And I'm going to focus on three efforts going on in Lake Michigan that I think have the most bearing on increasing sturgeon recruitment in the lake these days. There's a lot of things you could talk about with sturgeon, but have limited time. And I'm going to apologize off the bat, too, that I'm going to have to skim through some of this stuff pretty quick so that I don't get us off too late right off the bat. So I apologize for that. I'm going to talk about streamside rearing and stocking efforts throughout the lake, and then some about the Menominee River sturgeon fish passage effort, and then finish up with some comments about young of the year protection during sea lamprey treatments on a couple of major rivers in Lake Michigan that people may want to be aware of. So streamside rearing on Lake Michigan has actually been going on for 15 years. It got started with the Little River Band facility up on the Manistee River. This is an effort that takes place on the backs of a whole bunch of people, primarily not me. So there's an awful lot of folks from all agencies working on these rivers that are carrying the load on this. I'm just the poor sap that got asked to give the talk today. For those that aren't aware, streamside rearing is just simply culturing sturgeon from egg through the first 4 to 5 months of life in small trailer-based hatcheries that are located streamside so that they can pump river water in through the facilities to try to emphasize imprinting or maximize imprinting of these fish so that when they're stocked into those rivers in which they're being reared, they have a greater chance of returning there when they mature. Inside the facilities, there's multiple tanks to try to rear female families separate so that when they're stocked, you can stock equal numbers of families to maintain or maximize genetic diversity. There are 6 facilities on Lake Michigan, 2 operated by Michigan DNR up in northern Green Bay on the cedar and whitefish, 2 operated primarily by Wisconsin DNR with assistance from River Edge Nature Center on the Kewaunee River and the Milwaukee River, and then Manistee River's Little River Band's operation, and the Gun Lake Tribe is the primary operator now down on the Kalamazoo River with partners from a number of us. The difference for the colored stars, the red stars for the Michigan and Wisconsin facilities indicate facilities that are reintroducing fish back into rivers where they no longer remained or had been extirpated or presumed extirpated. And because of that, those rivers need donor populations. So the donor populations for the cedar and whitefish are the Menominee and Peshtigo rivers, a couple of the larger populations on Lake Michigan. And then for the Kewaunee and the Milwaukee facilities, they're using the Wolf River population that's tributary to Lake Winnebago, a very, very large population and easy source of eggs. These facilities operate following the genetic stocking guidelines document that was put out in 2010 with a number of us participating in putting that together, primarily focusing on trying to protect remnant stocks and maximize genetic diversity over the long term with these stocking efforts. Looking at some of the successes over the last 15 years then, first of all, just numbers of fish stocked. After a few years of people getting their feet wet and working through some of the bugs, by 2008, 2009, most of the facilities had figured out how to rear sturgeon. These aren't necessarily hatchery folks. These are biologists and technicians that are working in the field. I'll note the red bars are the 2 supplementing systems. So on the Kalamazoo and the Manistee, where there are remnant populations, and those populations are being used as the gamete source. So they're collecting wild fertilized eggs and drifting larvae and bringing them into the rearing facilities to try to enhance their survival over what would happen with those larvae and eggs out in the wild. So that's a little different situation. They're dependent on what's produced in the river, and they're not trying to collect all of what's produced in the river. They're trying to collect a portion of them, maybe 10%, enhance the survival, so when they're stocked back out, they're increasing the population. So the numbers for those 2 rivers, the numbers stocked each year have always been fairly low, generally a couple hundred at best. The reintroduction rivers, Wisconsin facilities in the blue bars have generally been able to make or meet the stocking targets of around 1,200 fish per year on an annual basis. That's primarily because they've got a very easy gamete source in the donor population on the Wolf River. So getting females is not a difficult task, and they can always collect excess eggs have excess larvae, so they can usually rear up their capacity. The Michigan facilities in the green bars, very dependent on the success of collecting females and males in any given year, which can vary a lot depending on flow conditions and just access to those fish. It's, again, not a very easy job in many of these rivers. So stocking over time, about 45,000 fish have been stocked to date. You'll notice 2018 isn't on there. Some years are better than others, and 2018 wasn't a particularly good year across most of the facilities. Environmental conditions, flows were very high for one case, and then across many of the facilities, they were dealing with some food issues that reduced survival quite a bit. So sort of an anomaly last year, and I just haven't updated those numbers on these graphs. In addition to this number stock, though, is how's the diversity doing and what's being stocked out. And the recommendations, the targets that were trying to be met was effective population sizes of at least 8 and preferably around 20 per year per facility. And that's a combination of males and females that are collected and crossed. The minimum target has been reached in almost all years. Partway through the time series, some additional funding allowed for additional tank capacity or multiple family capacity within the facilities, so that at least in the Wisconsin facilities where they were able to get 8 females quite easily each year, they've been able to increase the effective population size going out. For the years that the targets aren't met, both stocking targets or population size targets, all that means is the duration or the period of time in which the stocking may have to occur may have to be extended longer than 25 years to meet the additional goals. So if you've got a low year, you stock fewer fish. You've only got 1 female, you stock only 1 female's worth. You just may have to operate the facility for longer time to meet the original objectives. The nice thing is with the wild collected eggs and larvae that are going on in the Manistee River, Kim Scribner, working with the Little River Band, was able to look at the parentage of those and determine that the diversity for those collections was really quite high. So there's a lot of parents that have been contributing to the fish that have been reared in that facility. So even though the numbers are low, the diversity has been quite high. So that's good news. These fish have wandered around quite a bit after they've been stocked, but that's not really the norm. These are probably the outliers, but it's known that these fish have the capacity to spread out throughout the lake fairly soon in their life. And so as subadults, they've been recaptured throughout the basin. But you'll always catch much higher numbers of fish stocked into the Milwaukee River in the Milwaukee Harbor area. The same up in northern Green Bay. The assessments that Michigan DNR is doing, they're catching pretty good numbers of fish stocked from those rearing facilities. So don't get the sense that the fish are wandering all over, but they have the capacity to do that. Thus the reason for hoping that they're well imprinted at the time that they're stocked. One trend that's been encouraging is the long-term time series from Michigan DNR's Lake-wide assessment plan netting. It started back in the 70s and had never been capturing sturgeon until 2005 when they caught their first fish, and since then the numbers have increased over the last 10 to 15 years, the total sample of 80 fish, and these are all subadults, so fish that are recruiting to the gear and then outgrowing the gear. So this is the average size has been fairly constant over time. These aren't old fish that are being caught, it's primarily juveniles. The majority of these are actually wild fish, not marked fish coming from the streamside hatcheries. Some of them are showing up from the streamside facilities, but it's a good indication that wild recruitment has also been increasing over this time period. And then kind of a celebration for Little River Band last year, they caught the first fish from a 2008 stocking that had come back to the river as a mature fish. So this wasn't something surprising. We figured this was happening. The stocking had been going on long enough. But a nice fish that was exactly the same, the right age and the right size for what we would expect for a male coming back to spawn for the first time. So just a nice confirmation that what people are doing is probably working. I'd like to switch and talk a bit about the Menominee River fish passage effort. The Menominee River has the largest sturgeon population in Lake Michigan that has access to Lake Michigan and Green Bay waters. And there are 2 dams very close to the river mouth, 4 kilometers, and then another couple kilometers upstream, that have prevented fish that are in the lower river from getting upriver into decent habitat for both spawning and for juvenile rearing. Again, this is an effort of a whole host of people. I'm one of many, and Michigan DNR has actually taken the responsibility for operating this facility on an annual basis. The power company has been fully on board and very cooperative and is providing the funding for the operation long-term per their FERC license. Looking from downstream, upstream, quite simply, there's a fish elevator that's been constructed in the powerhouse. The fish are collected. Sturgeon that are appropriate to be passed are then trucked upstream about a mile and put in back into the river above the second dam. And then, importantly, downstream protection and guidance has been installed at both the power canal on the upper dam and at the lower dam, so that when the fish are coming back downstream, they have a way to come downstream other than going through the turbines when all of the spill gates are closed. Just to give you an idea of what some of the constructions look like, the downstream protection and passage is now a fairly fine-spaced rack that provides guidance to a downstream chute that allows the fish to be discharged around the turbines. In the past, these racks were horizontal across the front of the building, were large enough just to keep large trees out, so small juvenile sturgeon could easily pass through and would have had to deal with the turbines. So we wanted to make sure this protection and passage opportunity was constructed before fish were being passed upstream. The fish elevator itself is constructed inside the building. It's a fairly large structure. It was a multi-million-dollar construction project. The hopper or the elevator that the fish ride up in is fairly large. The door comes down behind them after they swim in. There's a traction flow that's passed through this facility from upstream to downstream. This is the blue areas where the water is. And then the fish get lifted up through the elevator chute and discharged into some holding and sorting tanks. There's a fair bit online, videos, movies, TV shows that have documented the construction and operation of this. If you have interest, I would suggest you just do some Googling and you'll find a good bit of information about it, more than I have time to go into here. But basically, the traction flow is passing through. It's like a river flow. The fish swim into the elevator, get lifted up, dumped into the tanks. There's a lot of other species that are collected besides sturgeon. About 36 other species are typically caught in each of the spring and fall seasons of operation. The fish are then sorted. The fish that are not kept, so all the species other than sturgeon, are passed back downstream or sluiced downstream back into the lower river. And then the sturgeon that are appropriate to be passed upstream are kept. Ultrasound units have been used to sex them to determine their sexual readiness to go upstream. Transmitters have been implanted in these fish to be able to track their behavior and movements upstream. So quite a bit going on. Speaking of the upstream behavior, receivers for the transmitter work have been placed all up the Menominee River. And fortunately, the fish that have been passed upstream largely have behaved as we would hope. Within a couple of days, most of them move all the way upstream to the next dam where there's a good spawning area and remain there until the next spawning season. Approximately 85% of the fish, both males and females, as well as fish passed in the spring and the fall, have remained upstream through the next spawning cycle before moving back downriver and back into Green Bay. So again, it seems to be accomplishing what it intended. This is based on telemetry work with 120 tagged individuals that have been passed up the last 4 years. And from day one, the goal for at least the initial years of operation was not to capture and pass as many fish as possible, but it was to learn how to capture fish effectively and which fish were going to be most effective to pass upriver. So just looking at a typical spring, day-to-day catches can be quite variable. When you get to the spawning time, all of a sudden our catches peak, but these fish are fish that are close to in the act of spawning, not ideal candidates to be moving upstream because you'd interrupt their spawning and then they have to swim for 2 days to get to the next spawning site. So it's really trying to maximize the catch of fish during this time period in the spring and in the fall prior to spawning. Efficiency of numbers of fish in the river compared to what are captured looked like they're between 7 and 10% so far. But the operation has been varying a number of variables. We can't control the temperature, we can't control the discharge, but we can control the attraction flow pass through, we can control how often the elevator is lifted during the day, and we can control when people are there to operate it, daytime, nighttime, morning, evening, etc. And we've benefited from a lot of assistance from UW-Stevens Point, professors and graduate students who have been helping assist in the operation and then analyzing the data, modeling both duration of lift, time of day and attraction flow all seem to be positively correlated with greater attraction flow. Longer time that the elevator door is left open, the fish don't seem to mind hanging around for a little while. And then time of day, the results indicating that as long as the temperatures are right in the spring and the fall, evening or nighttime is better than daytime. Longer durations of operation, so rather than lifting the elevator every 5 minutes, you might as well leave it in for 30 to 60 minutes and you'll still catch and collect more fish. And then the higher the attraction flow, the better. That's kind of an offset with the power company obviously would like to use as little water as possible because water is money. Over the last 4 years, the numbers that have been collected and passed have increased, even though the operation has been randomized, so we haven't been trying to operate it as best possible. We've been operating it in a way to learn the most. Not all the fish collected are mature fish. Some are smaller and then are passed back downstream. And generally the fish passed up, we've been trying to pass 2 males per female over these 4 years. But I think from here on, we'll be able to maximize by just operating at night with ideal attraction flows and probably be able to maintain or increase this catch with less effort. And then finally, I'd like to just wrap up by talking about some of the young of the year sturgeon protection work that's being done in concert with lamprey controls. Back in 2014, Jeff Slave gave a nice presentation here that highlighted some of the issues with TFM and lamprey control with sturgeon survival. So it was sturgeon were one of the species that were susceptible to non-target mortality. And particularly at the concentrations that are needed to have an effective lamprey treatment, the probability is pretty high of killing juvenile sturgeon. Not treating was not an option, and everybody realized that. But a couple of the rivers that are particularly susceptible are the Manistee River and the Muskegon River, both of which in Lake Michigan have pretty good wild sturgeon populations. So this was a bit of a concern. Little River Band for a number of years have been doing young of the year assessments, going out at night with spotlights, and you can just simply spotlight the fish and scoop them up, and they've been able to collect them, tag them, and re-release them for a number of years. And they realized, well, maybe we've got a solution here. And so working with the Fish and Wildlife Service, Michigan DNR, they realized, let's just pull those fish out of the river if those assessments can be done just prior to the lamprey treatments, and then bring them into the rearing facility that they have on site and hold them during the time that the lamprey treatment occurs. The Sea Lamprey Control Program is doing everything they could to try to minimize this effect, but you don't want to reduce the effectiveness on lamprey, and so this was a nice way to get the sturgeon out of the river, as many of them as you could, so that the treatments could continue, and then just put them back in the river, take them back out to exactly where you caught them. All the fish were marked. We knew where they were coming from. So this has, I think, been fairly effective. It's a lot of effort, but the numbers that have been removed and thus saved has been comparable to what's been reared in some of the rearing facilities. So it may seem like a lot of work, but it's probably still cost effective compared to some of the other things that are done with sturgeon. Sturgeon restoration is not cheap no matter how you do it. Just looking at some of the numbers in the years prior to the removals, the numbers are low, but it looked like after a treatment about half of the sturgeon that were collected post-treatment were dead, and maybe half of them lived. In 2016 and 2017, when the fish were removed on the Manistee, it's 117 that were removed and then put back, so it didn't experience mortality. Monitoring occurring right after the treatment, before these fish were put back in, showed that of those that were still left out there, most of them that we found were dead rather than alive. And then later surveys with recaptures of these fish indicated that this did constitute most of the year class that year, so the saving of those fish was important. And then similarly in Muskegon in 2017, a much smaller year class it looked like, not nearly as many fish, but again the ability to pull them out and put them back. With that, I'm sure I'm about out of time. So there's an interesting story behind this picture, but I'm just using it to show that I think sturgeon numbers are coming up. They're becoming more of an integrated component of the ecosystem. So you're likely to see normal things like this. This fish was still very much alive, and I'm not sure that he got eaten, but it was interesting. A photographer took this last week in the Kewaunee River and just happened to email it around to a few of us. Thank you very much.